Our next speaker is Dr. James McKendry. James is currently a postdoctoral fellow working in the lab of Professor Stuart Phillips' Protein Metabolism Research Group right here at McMaster University in the Department of Kinesiology. The focus of James's research is to explore the adaptive response of human skeletal muscle to use, i.e. resistance and aerobic exercise, disuse, i.e. immobilization and bed rest, and sarcopenia of aging. Speaking of aging, James notes that at the beginning of his PhD, he had 20/20 vision and a full head of hair. I will pass you on to James for more details.
Good evening, everybody, and thank you all very much for taking the time to come and listen to these presentations. With the holiday period just behind us, I think it's probably safe to assume that many of you will have just spent a large portion of that period being a total couch potato. During which I'm also willing to bet that most of you have been stuffing your face with chocolate and snacks. And if you're anything like me, you will have been binge watching Christmas movies on Netflix. Well, what do you get for being a couch potato? A trophy. Yay, right? Well, not quite. You get a special type of trophy. You get muscle atrophy. If you can't immediately tell, I'm from the UK, and if any of you have ever been across the pond and visited, you'll be familiar with the fact that our winters are sometimes a little chilly, but mostly they're pretty wet, which, to be honest, isn't that much different from the summer. For those of you here in Canada, it's often too cold, in some cases too dangerous, and quite often rather impractical to go outside during the coldest days of winter. Given that we are in the midst of the normal, whatever that means nowadays, flu season, and with COVID-19 cases still surging, lockdowns happening, curfews imminent, and vaccines being rolled out at a snail's pace, combined with the Christmas holidays just behind us, it is very likely that many of us have just spent and will be spending a significant amount of time like this over the coming weeks and probably even months. Well, believe it or not, and this probably shouldn't come as a shock to you, but that might not be the best approach if you want to stay healthy for this winter and beyond. Physical inactivity can be forced upon a person by an acute event, such as a broken arm or leg, or becoming bedbound due to an illness. However, reduced physical activity, such as step reduction, is a long-term choice that brings about multiple negative health consequences. It's safe to assume, I think, that many of us understand the benefits of physical activity: increased muscle mass, muscle strength, reduced risk of disease development, and a better overall quality of life. However, we tend to be far less aware of how damaging reduced physical activity can be for our health. And this is particularly problematic for older couch potatoes, as they just don't possess the same bounce back ability as from these acute periods of reduced activity that younger couch potatoes do. Our research group has now performed several studies within which we reduced the daily step count of older individuals by about 75% to around 1,500 steps per day. This is a number similar to those that a housebound during the pandemic would typically take, and is probably viewed by most as a particularly benign change in activity. However, we've shown that in just 2 weeks of reduced activity, that can have disastrous consequences for older people's health. Specifically, we showed that 2 weeks of physical inactivity led to a decrease in muscle size by up to 4%, an increase in insulin resistance by up to 1/3, and this is a warning sign for the development of type 2 diabetes. But we also know that inactivity leads to an increase in body fat, and in particular ectopic fat deposition, precisely where you don't want it around your organs, as this is a significant risk factor for several diseases. And finally, inactivity can significantly impact one's mental health and lead to social isolation, which can be a significant concern amongst older individuals and those undergoing the current pandemic. Thankfully, it's not all doom and gloom. And there are a number of things you can do throughout this winter with your muscles intact to stay fit and healthy. Resistance exercise or strength training remains to be the most potent strategy to maintain or increase your muscle and strength. So if you're fortunate enough to have access to a gym or some sort of home gym setup, that's awesome. And I'd recommend, in line with the World Health Organization's recent guidelines, that individuals, both young and old, participate in some form of resistance, exercise, or muscle strengthening activities at least twice per week, targeting the major muscle groups. However, I've got some good news for those of you that don't have the same access to exercise facilities. It doesn't have to be quite so complicated. There are tons of alternatives you can do at home, such as bodyweight exercises like push-ups, squats, lunges, or with some very basic equipment like resistance band, you can perform a pretty good home workout. Ultimately, if you perform them with a high degree of effort, such that it feels pretty difficult, you're going to get stronger and prevent at least some of that muscle mass loss. However, while resistance exercise is a great option, it's not always feasible or appealing to individuals despite its health benefits. And if this is the case, then reducing the amount of time you spend being sedentary can go a long way to keeping you healthy. Simply adding a daily walk by yourself or with a partner, or taking the dog for a walk, wearing your mask appropriately, of course, or perhaps going for a bike ride or a run, or even climbing some of Hamilton's many stairs are excellent alternatives. Or perhaps you could try incorporating some lower intensity strengthening exercises like yoga or Pilates to your daily routine. And all of these simple, easily achievable strategies can have a significant physical and mental health benefits. And adding them to your daily schedule with a partner or friend will increase the likelihood of you actually doing them. Put simply, for muscle and more generally overall health, it truly is a case of move it or lose it. To wrap things up, and if there's one thing that I'd like you to take away from this talk, given how quickly reduced physical activity can sap your strength and damage your health, getting up off the couch and doing something now is the best way to power through this cold, dark winter and beyond, so that you don't become that champion couch potato in the race for muscle atrophy. Thanks very much.
Thank you, James, for your talk. And I'm just looking at the poll answers. And unfortunately for me and the majority of our audience, a lot of us are hovering around about 3,000 steps today. So I just want to hear, how have you been staying active? And have you tried anything new since the lockdown?
Unfortunately, for those of you that answered around 3,000, that's probably not good enough to keep your health throughout the winter. But that's a really good question, Connie. Once the gyms closed for the second time in the fall, anticipating this current COVID crisis might not resolve itself as quickly as we might like, my housemates and I converted our garage into some sort of makeshift gym with some weights, a bike turbo trainer, and a rowing machine. But to be honest, my favorite thing to do whilst we're stuck at home is going for a pretty long, maybe an hour-long walk. I live in the Chinook neighborhood of Hamilton, so I'm able to tackle some of those stairs that I highlighted. And because I like to be efficient, I also combine that by listening to an audiobook.
Thank you for that, James. I'm thinking of going for a walk after this tonight myself. I'm at about 1,500 steps, unfortunately.
Yeah, that's the same as those that took part in the step reduction study. So that needs fixing, I'm afraid.
How many steps are in that 1 hour walk that you go on? And maybe just give us a bit more advice on how do you get motivated to do this?
That's a very good question. I mean, it depends a little bit on height and the speed within which you walk. I would say typically around the hour-long walk for me is about 7,500 steps. So close to the 8,000 threshold that people should be achieving each day. To get motivated, that's a very different question. I think hopefully making people aware of the benefits of physical activity, but also on the flip side of that, making sure that people know how damaging inactivity can be, and how long it takes to recover from some people. So, yeah.
And we have one final question for James. So you talked about how being sedentary could be detrimental at different time points in life. Can you make the case that it's never too late asking for a friend?
You definitely can. There's always something you can do, and picking up exercise, no matter what age, is always going to be a good idea. I briefly touched upon it during the presentation when I threw up the image of the older couch potato, but it depends on a couple of factors. But in general, younger people have a far greater ability to recover from these shorter periods of reduced physical activity than older people. In fact, older individuals often display this phenomenon called anabolic resistance, which simply put means they're less able to mount this muscle building response to exercise and protein nutrition. And that's something that's not present in younger individuals. That being said, they're not completely resistant, and doing something is always going to be better than doing nothing.
Thank you so much, James.